3 days after I buried my husband, the billionaire who managed his firm called my private line at midnight. "I found a hidden file," he said, his voice unusually tight. "Get to my penthouse right now." Before hanging up, he delivered a chilling warning: "Do not breathe a word to your stepmother. You are the target." When the private elevator doors opened and I saw exactly who was sitting in the dark waiting for me, my blood ran cold. If you have ever had to stay strong while your world collapsed, tell me where and what time you are listening to this right now. I did not cry. I did not let my hands shake. The phone felt like a solid block of ice against my cheek. It was 11:42 at night, and the house was draped in absolute silence. Harrison's voice on the other end of the line had been tight, clipped, completely stripped of his usual polished billionaire charm. I hung up the receiver and stood perfectly still in the dim hallway. I did not wake anyone. I just pulled on my old, faded canvas field jacket. The one Arthur always joked made me look like a proper dirt-kicking geologist. The fabric was stiff, smelling faintly of pine and old rain. I grabbed my car keys, the metal biting into my palm. My mind is trained to read fault lines. I spend my life analyzing pressure points deep within the earth, searching for the exact moment a rock face will fracture. Right now. I was scanning my own life for those same fractures. I stepped out into the freezing night. The steering wheel of my truck was cold to the touch. The streets of Denver were completely empty, illuminated only by the sickly, rhythmic flash of passing streetlights. I drove with mechanical precision. I have navigated treacherous mountain passes in Alaska with zero visibility, so driving downtown in the dark required no real effort. I left the radio off. The silence was better. It gave me room to think. Margaret and Beatrice. Why would Harrison specifically warn me against them? Margaret had been performing the role of the devastated mother-in-law flawlessly since Arthur's heart stopped. Beatrice had played the supportive sister, hovering around the kitchen with fake sympathy. But I had always known their bedrock was unstable. You do not study core samples for 20 years without learning how to spot a hollow foundation. Margaret's grief was just another layer of sediment, hiding whatever toxic minerals lay beneath. I pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. The towering glass headquarters of Harrison's mining and real estate empire loomed ahead. It looked like a jagged shard of black obsidian cutting into the night sky. The underground parking garage was desolate. My heavy boots echoed loudly against the concrete as I walked toward the private entrance. I did not feel fear. Fear is a useless emotion when the ground is collapsing beneath you. I felt a cold, calculated readiness. The security guard at the desk did not ask for my name. He simply nodded, swiped a master keycard, and gestured toward the executive elevator. The doors slid shut, sealing me inside a polished steel box. The quiet hum of the ascent felt strangely like being lowered deep into a mine shaft. I was moving toward the dark to find whatever had triggered the alarms. I closed my eyes for just 1 second. I pictured Arthur's gentle face. He had always handled the audits, the numbers, the quiet safety of our home. He was the anchor. Now, the anchor was gone, and a storm was brewing. The soft chime of the elevator broke the silence. Floor 40. The steel doors parted. I opened my eyes. I was ready for them. I stepped out of the elevator into the cavernous executive suite. The lights were dimmed, casting long, sharp shadows across the imported marble floors. Harrison stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the scattered lights of Denver. He turned when he heard my boots on the stone. He looked 10 years older than he had at Arthur's funeral just a week ago. But he was not the reason my breath caught in my throat. Sitting at the massive mahogany conference table was another man. He was sorting through a stack of thick, heavily redacted documents. The man wore a faded gray suit and silver wire-rimmed glasses. When he looked up, his sharp, analytical eyes locked onto mine. I stopped walking. Julian. Julian was an elite financial fraud investigator who used to work closely with Arthur. 5 years ago, Julian had quietly vanished after exposing a massive corporate embezzlement ring. Everyone assumed he was living off the grid, hiding from the people he had put behind bars. Yet here he was, sitting in Harrison's penthouse office at midnight, looking entirely too calm. I did not scream or ask foolish questions. I walked slowly to the table and pulled out a leather chair. I sat down across from him. I folded my hands on the cool wood. "You are supposed to be a ghost, Julian," I said, my voice steady. Julian offered a tight, grim smile. "Ghosts see everything, Eleanor," he replied softly. He pushed a heavy, unsealed manila folder across the polished table. Written across the front in black marker were 3 words: "The Pasture Legacy." That was the name of my family's estate. It was a sprawling, beautiful piece of land in the Colorado foothills. Passed down from my father. It was the only place I truly felt at peace. The place where Arthur and I had planned to raise our adopted son. "Arthur did not just handle your taxes, Eleanor," Julian began, his tone methodical and measured. Before he passed, he uncovered a network of unauthorized wire transfers, shell companies, forged signatures. Julian tapped the thick folder. "Margaret has been very busy while you were away on your geological surveys." Harrison walked over, his face lined with grim exhaustion. "Margaret is attempting to liquidate the pasture legacy. Eleanor, she is trying to sell it out from under you to a very dangerous, private mining conglomerate. And she is using your grief as a smokescreen." I stared at the manila folder. I did not open it yet. I did not need to see the forged ink to know they were telling the truth. The pieces clicked into place with terrifying precision. Margaret's sudden overbearing presence at my house. Beatrice's constant questions about Arthur's life insurance. They thought I was just a dirt-kicking engineer who did not understand money. They thought Arthur's sudden death had left me unprotected. They were wrong. Arthur had left me a map. "What else?" I asked Julian, keeping my voice dangerously flat. Julian adjusted his glasses. "What you are about to hear will erase everything you believed about your family." I did not look away. The war had quietly begun. I drove back through the silent, sleeping city. The sky in the east was just beginning to bruise a deep, faded purple. It was 4:15 in the morning. My mind was processing Julian's audit reports like raw geological data. Margaret had forged my signature on preliminary land transfer agreements. She had set up offshore accounts in Beatrice's name. They were moving quickly, hoping my grief would keep me blind and compliant. But the financial betrayal was not what made the blood hammer in my temples. It was the realization of what would happen if Margaret succeeded. I pulled my truck into the gravel driveway of our suburban home. The house was perfectly quiet, wrapped in the stillness of early dawn. I unlocked the front door and bypassed the kitchen, walking straight down the hallway. I gently pushed open the door to the guest bedroom we had converted into a little boy's room. A small nightlight cast a warm, amber glow across the walls. Leo was sound asleep. He was 8 years old, the orphaned son of a colleague who had died in a mining collapse years ago. Arthur and I had taken him in, loved him, and made him ours. Leo was lying on his side, his small chest rising and falling in a slow, peaceful rhythm. His arms were wrapped tightly around an old, scuffed teddy bear that Arthur had given him on his 5th birthday. I stood in the doorway, watching him. This was the vulnerable heart of my world. If Margaret managed to steal the pasture legacy and drain my trust fund, it would not just ruin me, It would destroy the secure, stable life Arthur and I had painstakingly built for this little boy. Margaret had never liked Leo. She called him the charity case when she thought I could not hear. If she gained financial leverage over me, I knew exactly what she would do next. She would use the courts to argue I was an unfit mother, too poor and too unstable to care for a child. She would try to rip him away just to break me completely. I stepped softly into the room and pulled the woven blanket up over Leo's small shoulders. He sighed in his sleep, holding the bear closer. I felt a fierce, burning resolve settle deep inside my chest. It was a cold fire. Margaret and Beatrice thought they were playing a game of numbers and signatures with a clueless widow. They did not understand the kind of woman they were dealing with. I was an engineer. I knew how to dig deep, how to withstand immense pressure, and how to detonate obstacles with absolute precision. I gently brushed a lock of dark hair from Leo's forehead. No one was going to touch this child. No one was going to take the land my father left me. I walked out of his room and closed the door with a soft click. The sun was rising above the trees. The mourning period was over. To understand how Margaret operates, you have to understand the anatomy of a parasite. She never attacks frontally. She slowly intertwines herself with the host until you cannot tell where she ends and you begin. I was 12 years old when my father first brought Margaret into our home. My mother had passed away 3 years prior, leaving my father drowning in a quiet, suffocating loneliness. Margaret arrived wrapped in cashmere sweaters and smelling of expensive, heavy perfume. She brought Beatrice with her, a spoiled, loud girl who immediately demanded my bedroom because it had the better view of the garden. My father, blinded by his desperate need for companionship, gave Margaret everything she asked for. He thought she was a gentle soul. I saw the truth within the first month. Margaret was a master of the velvet-covered thorn. She never raised her voice. She never laid a hand on me. Instead, she used 1,000 tiny, calculated cuts to sever my connection to my father. I remember the day of my 14th birthday. I had spent weeks studying for the regional science fair, building a complex geological model. My father had promised to attend the award ceremony. But that morning, Margaret suddenly developed a terrible, debilitating migraine. She lay on the antique sofa, pressing a silk handkerchief to her forehead, sighing weakly. She told my father to go, insisting she would be fine alone. But her voice trembled with perfectly engineered frailty. Of course, my father stayed by her side. I stood on the auditorium stage later that afternoon, holding my first place ribbon, looking out at an empty folding chair in the third row. When I got home, Margaret was miraculously cured, sipping Earl Grey tea in the sunroom. She looked at my blue ribbon, offered a small, pitying smile, and said it was nice that I had my little hobbies, since I clearly lacked Beatrice's natural charm. That was her strategy: isolation and diminishment. She slowly convinced my father that I was distant, difficult, and obsessed with dirt and rocks. She managed the household finances, quietly redirecting funds to buy Beatrice designer clothes and private equestrian lessons, while I wore my cousin's hand-me-downs. I learned very early that complaining was useless. Margaret would just cry and tell my father how hard she was trying to love his troubled daughter. So, I stopped talking. I retreated into my books, my science, and the sprawling acres of the pasture legacy. I learned to watch her in silence. I studied her patterns, her lies, and her manipulations the way I studied the crystalline structures of quartz under a microscope. I learned to survive by becoming invisible, by building a fortress of quiet discipline that she could never penetrate. She thought she had beaten me back then. She thought my silence was submission. She never realized that I was just taking notes. The past was simply prologue to the present. I remembered every single lesson. The true depth of Margaret's systemic cruelty revealed itself the year my father passed away. I was in my final year of university, immersed in applied geology, when his heart simply gave out one quiet Tuesday afternoon. I returned home for the funeral to find that Margaret had already begun erasing him from his own house. She worked with astonishing speed. His heavy oak desk, where he used to sketch topographic maps of the pasture legacy, had been replaced with a fragile, modern glass table. His vintage brass surveying compass, the one he had explicitly promised to pass down to me, was mysteriously misplaced. I did not bother arguing when I later spotted it sitting casually on Beatrice's dresser, treated as a cheap decorative paperweight. Margaret did not physically throw me out of the house. She was much too clever for that sort of vulgar display. She simply made it exceptionally clear, through 1,000 tiny exclusions, that there was no longer a space for me in her immaculate new life. She changed the locks, citing neighborhood security, and somehow kept forgetting to give me a spare key. I did not fight her for the house in the suburbs. I packed my heavy field boots, my textbooks, and my father's old leather journal. I let her have the fine china and the crystal chandeliers. I turned my focus entirely toward the earth, seeking out the most remote, punishing environments I could find. I took contracts in the frozen tundras of Alaska and the unforgiving high-altitude mines of the Andes. The extreme cold and the physical exhaustion were a perfect antidote to the suffocating environment Margaret had created. I learned how to stand my ground against driving blizzards and arrogant drilling foremen. I built a formidable career by analyzing pressure, stability, and the hidden structures beneath the surface. Margaret thought she had successfully exiled me to the wastelands. She thought she had won the only prize that mattered. She did not realize that while she was busy redecorating a suburban living room, I was forging myself into a weapon of absolute endurance. I was learning how to survive in environments where a single miscalculation meant total collapse. I let her keep the temporary victory. I chose the long game. For a long time, I believed that my fierce independence meant I had to walk through life entirely alone. Then, I met Arthur. We met in a sterile corporate boardroom in Denver. My mining firm had brought in an external auditing team to review a massive, complex logistical budget. Arthur was the lead auditor. He was a man of numbers, structure, and quiet precision. While the other executives tried to talk over me, Arthur simply listened. He watched me dismantle a flawed drilling proposal with cold logic, and when the meeting ended, he did not offer me a patronizing compliment. He offered me a cup of black coffee and a genuinely brilliant question about soil density. Arthur never asked me to soften my edges. He never felt threatened by the fact that I spent 8 months of the year wearing steel-toed boots in sub-zero temperatures. He was my absolute opposite in practice, yet my exact match in spirit. He fought his battles in spreadsheets and ledgers, moving numbers with the same tactical brilliance I used to map underground fault lines. When we adopted Leo, after a tragic accident claimed the lives of a colleague and his wife, it was Arthur who suggested it. He took on the daily rhythms of fatherhood with graceful ease. When I was deployed to an isolated survey camp in Alaska, a satellite phone call with Arthur was my only tether to sanity. I can still remember the sound of the wind howling against my reinforced canvas tent, the temperature dropping to 30 below zero. Arthur's voice would crackle through the heavy static, warm and remarkably steady. He would tell me about Leo's school projects, about the garden he was planting at the pasture legacy, about the small, beautiful architecture of our shared life. He was my anchor in the storm. He held our family together, allowing me to build my career without an ounce of guilt. People often assume the person waiting at home is the weaker partner. They are entirely wrong. It takes an immense, quiet strength to hold the foundation steady while someone else battles the elements. Now, that foundation was gone. I had to be the anchor. The sky on the day of Arthur's funeral was a dull, heavy gray. It was the kind of weather that mirrored the leaden weight sitting in my chest. I stood at the edge of the polished mahogany casket, wearing a simple black dress, my posture perfectly straight. I did not shed a single tear in public. Grief, to me, is a profoundly private matter, not a spectacle to be consumed by strangers. Margaret, however, treated the funeral like a theatrical debut. She arrived wearing a dramatic black veil, leaning heavily on Beatrice's arm. She wept with astonishing volume, her shoulders shaking as she accepted the condolences of Arthur's former colleagues. It was a flawless performance of a devastated mother-in-law. Beatrice stood beside her, occasionally dabbing at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed tissue. Every few minutes, Beatrice would discreetly check the screen of her phone, her thumb swiping with practiced boredom. I watched them from a distance, my face a mask of polite, frozen gratitude. I scanned the faces of the attendees, a habit ingrained from years of assessing safety risks on busy drilling sites. Most were friends, neighbors, and corporate acquaintances. But hovering near the back, standing near the shade of an old elm tree, was a man who did not belong. It was Marcus. He was the biological uncle of our adopted son, Leo. Marcus was a notorious gambler with a long history of bad debts and broken promises, a man who had not shown a single ounce of interest in Leo for the past 8 years. Yet here he was, wearing a cheap suit that did not fit, his eyes darting nervously around the affluent crowd. When Marcus caught my eye, he did not offer a nod of sympathy. He offered a sly, knowing smirk before turning and disappearing behind a row of marble headstones. A cold warning bell chimed in the back of my mind. Marcus had no money, no transportation, and absolutely no reason to be in Denver. Someone had paid for his ticket. Someone had invited him. I looked back at Margaret. She was gently wiping a tear from her cheek, accepting a cup of water from a wealthy bank executive. Her eyes briefly flicked toward the spot where Marcus had just been standing. The pieces were moving. I saw the board clearly. 2 days after we laid Arthur to rest, I sat down at my kitchen table to handle the necessary administrative work. Arthur was meticulously organized, so I expected the estate transition to be a simple matter of signing standard documents. I opened my laptop and called the senior manager at our primary bank to release the funds for the funeral expenses. The manager's voice on the phone was apologetic, hesitant, and carefully rehearsed. "I am so sorry, Eleanor, but a temporary hold has been placed on the primary accounts. We received a preliminary directive from the executor." I frowned, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am the sole beneficiary and executor of my husband's estate." "What directive?" There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the line. "The paperwork submitted yesterday lists your stepmother, Margaret, as the emergency conservator of the trust, pending a medical review. She filed the documents through her legal counsel." I did not raise my voice. I did not demand to speak to a supervisor. I thanked the manager politely and ended the call. I sat in the quiet kitchen, staring at the blank screen of my laptop. Margaret had moved with terrifying speed. She had somehow weaponized a dormant legal loophole, throwing a bureaucratic wall between me and my own financial resources. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Margaret's name. I let it ring 3 times, controlling my breathing, before answering. "Eleanor, darling." Margaret's voice was dripping with synthetic honey. "I know the bank must have confused you this morning. Please do not worry your pretty head about it. Arthur's sudden passing has clearly taken a severe toll on your mental health. I am just stepping in to handle the stressful paperwork so you can focus on resting. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was framing a hostile financial takeover as an act of maternal mercy. If I screamed at her, I would sound unstable. If I threatened her, I would give her the exact reaction she needed to prove I was irrational. "Thank you, Margaret," I said softly, injecting just the right amount of exhaustion into my voice. "It is all just so overwhelming right now." "I know, sweetheart. Just rest." She purred. I hung up the phone. The trap was fully set. To defeat an enemy who relies on manipulation, you must give them exactly what they expect to see. Margaret needed me to be a broken, confused widow. She needed me to be too consumed by grief to notice the intricate legal web she was spinning around me. I decided to give her an Oscar-worthy performance. Later that week, Margaret visited the house under the guise of bringing me a casserole. I made sure she found me sitting in the dimly lit living room, wearing an oversized sweater, my hair pulled into a messy knot. I had deliberately skipped my morning coffee to ensure my eyes looked tired and unfocused. When she walked in, carrying a folder of legal documents under her arm, I offered a weak, trembling smile. I stood up to pour her a cup of tea. As I handed her the delicate porcelain saucer, I intentionally let my hand shake, causing the silver spoon to clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor. "Oh, I am so sorry," I whispered, pressing my fingers to my temples. "I just cannot seem to concentrate lately. I keep forgetting things." Margaret's eyes gleamed with a predatory satisfaction. It was a micro-expression, gone in a fraction of a second, but I caught it. She knelt down, picked up the spoon, and patted my hand with condescending warmth. "Hush now. Eleanor, you have been through a terrible trauma. That is exactly why Beatrice and I are here to help you carry this heavy burden." She opened the folder and placed a stack of complex trust addendums on the coffee table. The documents were dense, filled with aggressive legal jargon designed to slowly strip away my administrative rights over the pasture legacy. "Just a few standard signatures, darling," Margaret murmured, handing me a heavy gold pen, "to simplify the tax burdens while you recover." I picked up the pen. I held it awkwardly, staring blankly at the pages as if the words were written in a foreign language. I asked a few naive, helpless questions about tax codes, questions Arthur would have laughed at, knowing my actual capacity for data analysis. Margaret answered with soothing lies, her confidence growing with every feigned sigh I produced. I did not sign anything of substance. I simply nodded, promised to read them later when my head stopped aching, and let her believe I was inches away from total surrender. When Margaret finally left, confident in her impending victory, I stood by the window and watched her luxury sedan pull away. I dropped the trembling act instantly. My hands were perfectly steady. I walked to the kitchen, poured the cold tea down the sink, and picked up the phone to call Julian. The facade was flawless. Now, we hunt. The following evening, I met Julian at a discreet, dimly lit booth in the back of a quiet downtown steakhouse. The restaurant was practically empty, filled only with the soft clinking of silverware and the low hum of jazz. Julian slid a sleek, encrypted tablet across the polished mahogany table. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened a digital topographical map of the pasture legacy. As a geologist, I knew every ridge and valley of that land by heart. I knew the surface. I knew the soil. But Julian tapped the screen, revealing a secondary layer of deep-scan ground-penetrating radar data that I had never seen before. "Arthur commissioned this private survey 18 months ago," Julian said softly, his eyes scanning the room out of sheer habit. "Margaret is not trying to sell your land because it has a nice view of the mountains. Eleanor. She is trying to sell it because of what is underneath. I stared at the bright blue and red density markers on the screen. The data was unmistakable. Veins of rare, highly sought-after industrial minerals ran directly beneath the old pastures. I felt a cold wave of realization wash over me. I had spent my entire career traveling to the harshest corners of the earth to find deposits like this, never realizing I had been sitting on a fortune my whole life. "How much?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Julian locked the tablet screen. "The conservative estimate places the total value of the estate and its subterranean assets at $45 million. That is the number Margaret is looking at. That is the prize she is willing to destroy you for. $45 million. The number hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. It explained the incredible speed of Margaret's attack. It explained the forged signatures and the desperate rush to secure control of the trust, while I was supposedly blinded by grief. She was not just a greedy stepmother trying to steal an inheritance. She was a woman trying to orchestrate a massive, illicit corporate land grab before I ever looked at the soil reports. I took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water. I did not gasp. I did not let my hands tremble. I simply processed the new data, adjusting my internal models to account for the massive scale of the threat. The battlefield had just expanded exponentially. "She thinks I am blind," I said quietly. Julian smiled grimly. "Let her keep believing it." I nodded in agreement. The stakes were absolute. Julian reached into his briefcase and produced a second, thinner file. He placed it carefully on the table, treating it with a quiet reverence that instantly caught my attention. The folder did not contain topographical maps or radar scans. It contained pages of dense, perfectly formatted legal and financial structures. "Arthur knew," Julian explained, his voice dropping to a low, steady register. "He noticed the discrepancies in Margaret's behavior over a year ago. He saw the unauthorized inquiries into the estate's deed, and instead of confronting her directly and giving her a chance to cover her tracks, he built a wall around you." I opened the file. It was a comprehensive blueprint of a highly secure financial vehicle, an irrevocable trust. While I had been away in the freezing winds of Alaska, trusting that my home was safe, my husband had been quietly transforming our assets into a fortress. He had meticulously transferred the ownership of the pasture legacy out of my direct, vulnerable name and into an impenetrable legal structure. He constructed it so that nobody, absolutely nobody, could alter the terms without triggering a cascade of federal audits. Julian continued. "He knew that if anything ever happened to him, Margaret would come for you. He spent the last year of his life making sure she would fail." I traced Arthur's precise, familiar signature at the bottom of the page. My chest tightened, not with sorrow, but with an overwhelming, profound respect. Most people equate love with loud declarations and grand, public gestures, but Arthur's love was different. His love was a meticulously engineered contingency plan. He had used the only weapons he possessed: numbers, clauses, and foresight to shield me and Leo from a predator he knew I was too busy to see. He never wanted to worry me while I was navigating dangerous drill sites. He simply did the work. He carried the burden in absolute silence, securing our future against a threat I had fatally underestimated. I closed the file and rested my hand flat against the cool cardboard cover. I did not cry, but a profound warmth spread through my chest, replacing the cold dread that had settled there since the funeral. I was not fighting this battle alone. Arthur was still standing right beside me, guiding my hand through every page of evidence he had left behind. He was my silent armor. I would not fail him. There was one piece of the puzzle that still did not fit. I am an engineer. I cannot proceed if the structural math is flawed. Margaret was greedy. Yes, but her current actions were reckless. Forging signatures, locking bank accounts, manipulating legal trusts. These were high-risk maneuvers that could easily result in federal prison. Margaret had always been a parasite who preferred the shadows. Why was she suddenly operating with the frantic, messy aggression of a cornered animal? I looked up at Julian, voicing my exact thought. Margaret is moving too fast. She is leaving a paper trail. This level of exposure contradicts her entire psychological profile. Why the rush? Julian's eyes darkened. He tapped the locked tablet on the table. Because she has already spent the money. Eleanor. I sat perfectly still, letting the implication wash over me. Julian explained the forensic trail he had uncovered deep in the encrypted ledgers. 3 months ago, Margaret had quietly accepted a massive, non-refundable down payment from a ruthless private mining syndicate based out of Nevada. The transaction had been washed through a series of offshore cryptocurrency accounts to hide the origin. She promised them the deed to the pasture legacy by the end of this fiscal quarter, Julian said, his tone clinical and chilling. She took their money, assuming she could manipulate Arthur or bypass him entirely while you were deployed. She gambled on her ability to control the board. The pieces snapped violently into place. The syndicate Margaret was dealing with did not tolerate delays. They were the kind of corporate entity that destroyed lives and erased companies without a second thought. If Margaret failed to deliver the deed to the land, they would not take her to civil court. They would systematically dismantle her life, seize her hidden assets, and bury her in dangerous, unpayable debts. She was not just fighting for a payday. She was fighting for her survival. That made her infinitely more dangerous. A predator hunting for a meal is cautious. A predator fighting to escape a trap will chew its own leg off to get free. She is desperate, I observed quietly, swirling the ice in my glass. Desperate people make catastrophic mistakes, Julian replied, but they also cause maximum collateral damage on their way down. You need to be prepared. Eleanor. She is going to aim for your weakest point. I knew exactly what my weakest point was. The warning came too late. The next morning, the doorbell rang just as I was pouring a bowl of cereal for Leo. I glanced at the security monitor mounted on the kitchen wall, standing on my front porch, shifting his weight from side to side in a cheap, poorly fitting suit. Was Marcus. I took a slow, deep breath. I turned to Leo, offering him a warm, reassuring smile. Eat up, buddy. I need to speak to someone at the door. Stay right here. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps silent on the hardwood. I unlocked the door and pulled it open, leaving the heavy security chain engaged. I looked at Marcus through the narrow gap. He smelled faintly of stale smoke and cheap cologne. Hello, Eleanor, Marcus said, flashing a wide, insincere grin that did not reach his eyes. Long time no see. Marcus, I replied, my voice devoid of any inflection. You have no business here. Leave before I call security. His grin vanished, replaced by a hard, calculating sneer. He held up a thick manila envelope, waving it slightly in the cold morning air. Actually, I have official business. I filed the paperwork at the courthouse this morning. I am seeking full legal custody of my nephew, Leo. The air in my lungs turned to ice, but I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. I simply stared at him, letting the silence stretch until he nervously shifted his feet. You have not seen Leo in 8 years, I stated evenly. You do not even know his middle name. I am his blood, Marcus shot back, his voice rising in an attempt to project authority. And considering your current situation a grieving widow, heavily medicated, exhibiting signs of severe mental instability, The court is going to look very favorably on a biological relative stepping in to protect the boy. He practically spat the words, mental instability. It was a direct echo of the narrative Margaret had been carefully planting for weeks. Margaret had bought Marcus. She had cleared his debts, bought him a suit, and aimed him directly at my heart. She knew I would give up the pasture legacy, the money, and the trust fund in a heartbeat to keep Leo safe. "You are trespassing, Marcus," I said quietly, my voice lowering to a dangerous calm. "Get off my property." I shut the heavy wooden door in his face and locked the deadbolt. I stood in the hallway, listening to his retreating footsteps on the gravel driveway. My heart was hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. They had crossed the line. I would break them. Exactly 30 minutes after Marcus's rusted car pulled out of my driveway, a sleek black sedan glided up to the curb. Margaret stepped out, wearing a cashmere coat and an expression of profound, theatrical concern. She had orchestrated the timing perfectly. Send the attack dog first, then arrive immediately after to play the savior. I opened the door and let her in, retreating into my carefully constructed role of the terrified, helpless widow. I wrapped my arms around myself, looking down at the floor as she guided me to the sofa. "Eleanor, darling, I just heard—" Margaret gasped, placing a manicured hand over her heart. "That awful man? Marcus. Beatrice told me he filed custody papers this morning. How could he be so cruel at a time like this?" I kept my eyes downcast, forcing my breathing to sound shallow and panicked. "Margaret, I do not know what to do. He says I am unstable. He says the judge will give him Leo. If you have ever had to sit across from a person you knew was lying to your face, and yet you maintained a perfect, polite silence to protect your endgame, drop a yes in the comments. It is a very specific kind of discipline." Margaret sat beside me, her voice dropping to a soothing, maternal whisper. "Hush now. I will not let that happen. I have the best lawyers in Denver on retainer. I can make Marcus disappear by tomorrow." She paused, letting the promise of safety hang in the air before delivering the extortion. "But my lawyers can only act on your behalf if you grant me full power of attorney. Just a temporary measure. Eleanor. Once I have the legal authority over the estate, I will crush Marcus and keep Leo safe for you." It was a beautiful, ruthless trap. Sign over the $45 million pasture legacy, and she would call off the dog she had hired in the first place. I looked up at her, letting my eyes fill with feigned, desperate gratitude. "You can really stop him," I whispered, my voice trembling perfectly. Margaret smiled, a cold, triumphant light dancing in her eyes. "I promise you, darling. Just sign the papers tomorrow, and I will handle everything." "Okay," I breathed, playing the defeated victim flawlessly. "Okay, Margaret. I will sign whatever you need." She squeezed my hand, victorious. She had no idea that she had just confirmed every single piece of Julian's theory. She thought she had broken me. She thought the game was over. I watched her leave. I needed to find Arthur's weapon. I left Margaret smiling in my living room and drove straight to the pasture legacy. The old, sprawling estate was quiet, the tall grass swaying in the cold afternoon wind. I parked my truck near the weathered wooden barn that Arthur had used as a workshop. Julian had told me the evidence was here, but he did not have the key. Arthur had left that specifically for me. I walked into the dusty barn. The air smelled of dried cedar and old motor oil. In the far corner, hidden beneath a heavy canvas tarp, sat a sturdy cedar chest. It was bound in iron, but it did not have a standard keyhole or a digital keypad. Instead, The heavy brass lock mechanism featured 3 circular indentations of varying depths. I stared at the lock, my mind racing. Arthur was a man of numbers, but he knew I was a woman of the earth. He would not use a numerical passcode. He would speak my language. A sudden memory struck me. A week before he died, Arthur had brought home 3 rough, uncut mineral stones. He had handed them to Leo, telling him they were special building blocks for his toy box. I had glanced at them briefly, a piece of green fluorite, a chunk of blue apatite, and a jagged shard of clear quartz. I turned around, drove my truck back to our suburban house at reckless speed, and walked straight into Leo's room. I dug through his wooden toy chest until my fingers brushed against cold stone. I pulled all 3 minerals out, placed them in my pocket, and drove back to the barn as the sun began to set. I knelt before the cedar chest. Arthur was asking me a question only an engineer could answer. I examined the 3 stones: fluorite, apatite, quartz. I mentally referenced the Mohs hardness scale, the universal standard for measuring mineral resistance. Fluorite was a 4, apatite was a 5, quartz was a 7. I placed the fluorite into the first indentation. I placed the apatite into the second. I pressed the sharp quartz into the third. I applied pressure, pushing the stones down in order of their ascending geological hardness. A complex series of tumblers shifted inside the brass casing. Arthur had not left his legacy to a weak, helpless widow. He had left it to a chief geologist. The profound respect in that silent gesture brought a sudden, tight ache to my throat, but I forced it down. The heavy lid clicked open. The inside of the cedar chest was perfectly organized, lined with fireproof metal. Resting on top was a thick, leather-bound binder and a small, encrypted USB drive. I lifted the binder out carefully, placing it on Arthur's old wooden workbench. I opened the first page. It was a complete, devastating forensic audit. Arthur's neat, cramped handwriting filled the margins, detailing every single unauthorized transaction Margaret had executed over the past 14 months. He had tracked the flow of money with surgical precision. He had documented her secret meetings with the Nevada mining syndicate. He had obtained copies of the forged preliminary land transfer agreements, highlighting the inconsistencies in the signature analysis. He had even managed to pull the offshore routing numbers Beatrice had used to hide Margaret's illicit down payment. I turned the pages, the dim light of the barn casting long shadows across the damning evidence. Margaret thought she was a master manipulator, moving unseen in the background. But Arthur had been watching her every single move. He had built a flawless, airtight legal case that would easily stand up in a federal court. At the very back of the binder was a single sheet of yellow legal paper. It was a note addressed to me. Eleanor, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the wolves are at the door. Do not confront her. Let her believe she is winning. Bring this to Julian. He knows what to do. I ran my fingertips over the ink. There was no fear in his writing. There was only absolute certainty. He knew my temperament. He knew that if he told me about Margaret's betrayal while I was stationed in Alaska, I would have flown home immediately and confronted her with righteous fury, giving her time to destroy the evidence. Instead, he asked for my patience. He asked for my signature discipline. He had handed me a loaded weapon and explicitly instructed me to wait for the perfect moment to pull the trigger. I closed the binder and slipped the USB drive into my jacket pocket. I looked out the barn window at the sprawling acres of the pasture legacy, the land my father had loved, the land Arthur had died protecting. I held her ruin in my hands. I brought the binder straight to Harrison's penthouse that same evening. Julian was waiting for us. He took the documents, his eyes scanning Arthur's meticulous ledgers with quiet, professional admiration. It is all here, Julian said, closing the binder with a solid thud. Wire fraud, forgery, corporate espionage, and tax evasion. Margaret is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. But that is not enough, Harrison interjected, his voice heavy with authority. Putting her in prison does not solve the immediate threat of Marcus taking Leo. If we just hand this to the police, Margaret will drag the custody battle out in family court for years. We need to neutralize her completely, instantly. Julian smiled, a cold, sharp expression. Arthur already thought of that. Harrison, look at Clause 4B of the Irrevocable Trust. Julian projected a digital copy of the trust document onto the wall monitor. He highlighted a densely worded paragraph buried deep in the legal framework. Arthur installed a poison pill, Julian explained. It is a self-destruct mechanism designed specifically for Margaret. I read the text carefully. The clause stated that if any party attempted to assume control of the trust by declaring the primary beneficiary me, mentally unfit or medically incapacitated, the trust would automatically and irreversibly liquidate. The Pasture legacy would instantly be donated to the federal government as a protected wildlife reserve, nullifying all commercial value. But it did not stop there. The clause also mandated that the legal action of declaring me unfit would automatically trigger an independent, third-party audit of the petitioner by the Internal Revenue Service, granting them full access to all offshore accounts tied to the petitioner's name. If you believe true justice is served cold, and that the best revenge is a trap the enemy springs on themselves, tell me you are still with me in the comments. If Margaret uses those fake medical records to declare you incompetent and steal the land, Julian said softly, she will accidentally donate the land to the government, erase the deed the Nevada syndicate paid her for, and invite the federal government to audit her stolen crypto accounts. It was brilliant. It was a perfect, inescapable legal guillotine. We were ready for the board. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a bitter, freezing wind sweeping down from the mountains. I dressed with meticulous care. I did not wear the oversized, comfortable sweaters of a grieving widow. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, the kind of armor I usually reserved for aggressive corporate negotiations. I pulled my hair back into a tight, severe knot. I arrived at Harrison's corporate headquarters at exactly 8:45 in the morning. The boardroom occupied the entire top floor, enclosed by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a commanding view of the city. At 9 o'clock precisely, the heavy oak doors opened. Margaret walked in, radiating an aura of absolute triumph. She wore a pristine white silk dress, a subtle declaration of her perceived victory. She looked like a queen arriving to accept the surrender of a conquered territory. Beatrice trailed behind her, scrolling mindlessly on her phone, wearing a designer jacket paid for with stolen funds. Margaret took a seat near the head of the massive mahogany table. She offered me a sweet, pitying smile. "Eleanor, darling, you look so tense. Do not worry. We are going to get all this complicated paperwork sorted out today. You will not have to worry about a thing." I sat directly across from her, my hands folded perfectly still on the polished wood. I did not return her smile. I simply looked at her, my expression completely blank. I studied her face, noting the slight tightening around her eyes, the microscopic tension in her jaw. She was confident, but she was also desperate. The Nevada syndicate was breathing down her neck, and today was her deadline. Harrison sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of grim authority. He opened a sleek leather folder and cleared his throat. "We are here to formally discuss the transition of the Pasture Legacy Trust and the emergency motions filed by Margaret's legal counsel regarding Eleanor's competency." Margaret nodded graciously, placing a stack of legal documents on the table. I have the power of attorney forms right here, Harrison. For Eleanor's own protection. Of course. I did not speak. I simply waited. The steel doors slid shut. Before we review those forms, Harrison said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet room, there is a presentation concerning the internal audit of the estate that must be entered into the official record. Margaret's polite smile faltered for a fraction of a second. An internal audit? I was not informed of this. Harrison. I really do not think we need to drag this out. Eleanor needs rest, not financial briefings. The oak doors at the back of the room opened. Julian stepped inside, carrying a black leather briefcase. He wore his faded gray suit, his silver glasses catching the morning light. Beatrice finally looked up from her phone, her brow furrowing in confusion. Margaret went perfectly still. She did not know who Julian was, but a predator always recognizes a threat. Julian walked to the front of the room, connected a small device to the central console, and dimmed the lights. The massive wall monitor flickered to life. "My name is Julian," he began, his tone calm and strictly procedural. "I am an independent forensic investigator. Over the past 14 months, Arthur commissioned me to track a series of severe financial discrepancies regarding the pasture legacy." The first slide appeared on the screen. It was a high-resolution scan of the forged land transfer agreement. Beside it was a side-by-side analysis of Arthur's authentic signature and the clumsy forgery Margaret had submitted. Margaret's face drained of color. The pristine white silk of her dress suddenly looked like a surrender flag. "This is outrageous," she snapped, her voice rising in pitch, the velvet facade finally cracking. "Harrison, what is the meaning of this? These are baseless accusations." Julian pressed a button. The next slide appeared. It was a detailed routing map of a cryptocurrency transaction. It showed exactly how $3 million had moved from a shell corporation in Nevada, bounced through 2 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and landed directly in a trust fund registered under Beatrice's name. "Financial mismanagement is one thing," Julian said evenly. "Accepting illicit down payments from a private mining syndicate to sell land you do not own is wire fraud." Beatrice gasped loudly, dropping her phone onto the table. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with genuine panic. She looked at her mother, waiting for a denial, an explanation, anything. But Margaret was entirely silent. Her jaw was clamped shut, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the mahogany table. I watched her world crumble. I did not gloat. I did not smile. There was nowhere left to hide. Margaret is a creature of pure survival. Even with the financial routing numbers displayed on the massive screen, she did not immediately fold. She straightened her posture, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. She looked at Harrison, dismissing Julian with a wave of her hand as if he were a minor annoyance. "This is an elaborate, pathetic fabrication," Margaret said, her voice dripping with practiced indignation. "Harrison, you cannot possibly entertain this nonsense. Eleanor is deeply unwell. Her grief has manifested into severe paranoia. I have a sworn affidavit from her own primary care physician stating that she is suffering from severe delusions and requires immediate psychiatric intervention." She was doubling down. It was a bold, desperate move to discredit the evidence by discrediting the source. She thought her medical sabotage was the one secret we had not uncovered. Julian did not argue. He simply pressed the button on his remote again. The screen shifted. The complex financial charts vanished, replaced by a massive, high-definition photograph. It was a social media post from Beatrice's public account. The image featured a close-up of a brightly colored iced coffee resting next to a new, incredibly expensive designer handbag. The caption read, "Retail therapy cures everything." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Julian zoomed in on the top right corner of the photograph. The designer bag was sitting on a table near a large plate glass window. The reflection in the glass was crystal clear. It showed the outdoor patio of the cafe. It showed Margaret, wearing her distinctive cashmere coat, sitting across from a man I recognized instantly as Dr. Eris, our family physician. Julian enhanced the contrast. In the reflection, Margaret was sliding a remarkably thick white envelope across the table into the doctor's hands. "The digital timestamp on this photograph," Julian noted quietly, "is exactly 45 minutes before Dr. Eris logged into the medical portal and altered Eleanor's prescription history. We have already submitted the metadata to the Medical Licensing Board. He is cooperating fully in exchange for leniency." Beatrice stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and panicked. Her own vanity, her desperate need to showcase her stolen wealth to the world, had provided the exact piece of forensic evidence we needed to destroy her mother's alibi. The silence in the room was absolute. Margaret looked at the screen, then slowly turned her head to look at her daughter. The expression on Margaret's face was not anger. It was total, hollow devastation. The medical lie was dead. I took a breath. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool mahogany table. Until this moment, I had allowed Julian and Harrison to control the flow of the room. It was time to assume command. I looked directly into Margaret's eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, measured cadence of an engineer identifying a structural failure. "You made a fundamental miscalculation, Margaret," I said softly. "You assumed that my silence was a symptom of weakness. You thought that because I did not scream, I did not see you." Margaret stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The polished, aristocratic mother-in-law persona had completely evaporated, leaving only a cornered, terrified woman. "I am the sole executor of Arthur's estate and the sole beneficiary of the pasture legacy," I stated, my words cutting through the heavy air. "Effective immediately, I am formally revoking any and all implied administrative access you believe you possess. You will not touch the trust, you will not sell the land, and you will absolutely never approach my son again." Harrison nodded in agreement, sliding a formal declaration across the table. "The board officially recognizes Eleanor's absolute authority. Your temporary petitions are denied. Margaret." I watched Margaret's eyes dart toward the digital clock on the wall. It was 9:30 in the morning. The Nevada Mining Syndicate expected the deed transfer to be initiated by noon. If she walked out of this room empty-handed, she was not just facing federal fraud charges, she was facing the wrath of a shadow corporation that did not forgive debts. She was out of time, out of allies, and out of options. She looked at Beatrice, who was quietly weeping into her hands, entirely useless. But a parasite does not die quietly. Margaret's fear suddenly calcified into a bitter, venomous rage. She stood up, planting her hands flat on the table, leaning toward me. "You think you are so clever," Margaret hissed, her voice dropping into an ugly, guttural register. "You think you can just dismiss me. You think a few photos and spreadsheets are going to stop me from taking what I am owed." She reached into her designer leather briefcase. Her hands were shaking violently, but her eyes burned with a manic, desperate light. "I am not leaving here with nothing. Eleanor." She spat. She pulled out a thick document sealed with a red court stamp. "The final attack." Margaret slammed the document down onto the mahogany table. She did not beg for mercy. She chose to burn the entire building down. "This is an emergency judicial injunction," Margaret declared, her voice echoing sharply. I filed it at dawn. Based on Marcus's pending custody lawsuit and the medical concerns, a judge has granted a temporary, absolute freeze on all assets tied to the Pasture legacy. You cannot revoke my access, Eleanor, because the state just stripped you of yours. The land is frozen. The accounts are frozen. She smiled, a ghastly, triumphant stretching of her lips. She thought she had found a loophole. If she could freeze the assets, she could buy herself time to negotiate with the Nevada syndicate. She thought she had trapped me in a legal stalemate. I looked at the red stamp on the injunction. Then, I looked up at her. I did not panic. I offered her a small, genuine, and chillingly calm smile. "Thank you, Margaret," I said softly. Her smile faltered. Confusion flickered across her face. "What did you say?" I reached out and slid a copy of the irrevocable trust document toward her. I tapped my index finger against Clause 4B. "Arthur knew you would try to use a medical injunction to seize control. So, he built a failsafe. A poison pill." I watched her eyes scan the text. I narrated it for her, keeping my voice perfectly level. "By filing a medical injunction to freeze my assets, you just triggered an automatic, irreversible liquidation protocol. As of the moment that injunction was stamped, the Pasture legacy was entirely donated to the Federal Parks Department as a protected wildlife sanctuary. The land cannot be mined. It cannot be sold. The deed you promised the syndicate no longer exists." Margaret stopped breathing. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as the reality of the words sank in. "Furthermore," I continued, my tone entirely clinical, "triggering Clause 4B automatically generates an electronic alert to the Internal Revenue Service, granting them full authorization to audit the petitioner. That is you, Margaret. They are looking into your offshore accounts right now." She had tried to lock the door to trap me, without realizing she had locked herself inside a burning room. She had destroyed her own payout and invited the federal government to examine her stolen money, all with a single piece of paper. She collapsed back into her chair. The trap snapped shut. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a catastrophic implosion. There was no screaming, no dramatic tossing of papers. There was only the sound of a woman realizing her life was entirely over. Margaret stared at the trust document, her mouth slightly open, her chest completely still. Beatrice had stopped crying and was looking at her mother with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. They both understood exactly what the loss of that deed meant. The federal authorities were the least of Margaret's problems. Right on cue, Margaret's cell phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of the conference table. We all looked at it. The screen illuminated, displaying an unknown, blocked caller ID. It buzzed relentlessly, vibrating across the mahogany surface like an angry insect. Margaret did not reach for it. She pulled her hands back and pressed them against her stomach, her face pale and covered in a sudden, cold sweat. The Nevada syndicate knew. They always monitored public court filings. They knew the land was gone, and they were calling to collect their debt. "You should probably answer that, Margaret," Julian suggested, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "They do not like to be ignored." Margaret slowly shook her head, unable to speak. Her carefully constructed empire of silk dresses and country club lunches had been vaporized in less than 20 minutes, entirely by her own hand. Harrison pressed a button on his intercom. "Security, please escort our guests to the lobby. Their business here is concluded." Two large, quietly professional men in dark suits stepped into the boardroom. They did not touch Margaret. They simply stood behind her chair, waiting. "Oh, one more thing," Julian added, checking a message on his encrypted tablet. Local police just picked up Marcus at his motel. He tried to pay his bill with a stolen credit card. The custody suit is officially dead. Margaret finally stood up. Her legs were unsteady. She looked at me, searching my face for a flicker of pity, a hint of the vulnerable girl she had tormented for decades. She found nothing but solid, unyielding stone. She turned and walked out of the room, Beatrice following closely behind like a frightened shadow. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. I exhaled slowly. The air was clean. 6 months passed. Time does not erase grief, but it does change the shape of it. It softens the jagged edges, turning sharp pain into a quiet, enduring strength. I spent those months exactly as I had promised Arthur I would. I focused on building the foundation. The pasture legacy was officially recognized as a federal wildlife sanctuary, but I retained the right to manage the administrative oversight and live in the primary residence. The threat of mining drills tearing up the earth was gone forever. The land was safe. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon in late autumn. I was walking across the expansive front lawn, the dry grass crunching satisfyingly beneath my boots. Leo was running a few yards ahead of me, his laughter carrying on the cool breeze as he chased our newly adopted golden retriever. He looked healthy, vibrant, and completely unburdened. The shadow of Marcus and Margaret had never even touched him. I stopped near the old cedar barn and watched him play. The contrast between the cold, sterile air of the corporate boardroom and the warm, golden sunlight of the estate was profound. I had not spoken to Margaret since the doors closed at Harrison's office. I did not need to. The news cycle handled the updates for me. She had surrendered herself to the federal authorities within 48 hours, choosing the safety of a heavily guarded prison cell over the terrifying reach of the Nevada syndicate. She pleaded guilty to every count of fraud and embezzlement. She traded her cashmere coats for a standard-issue uniform, locked away in a concrete box, stripped of the wealth and status she had destroyed her family to obtain. I felt no joy in her downfall, but I felt a deep, abiding sense of justice. She had engineered her own prison long before the judge handed down the sentence. I walked over to the wooden fence, leaning my arms against the rough timber. I looked out at the rolling hills, the pine trees swaying gently in the wind. The estate was not just a piece of property anymore. It was a living, breathing testament to Arthur's brilliance and his quiet, fierce devotion. I smiled, feeling the sun on my face. The storm was truly over. A full year passed before I saw Beatrice again. It was a cold, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was driving back to the estate from a geological conference in the city and decided to stop at a small, unremarkable diner on the outskirts of Denver for a cup of black coffee. The diner smelled of stale grease and industrial lemon cleaner, the kind of place that existed entirely in the gray margins of the city. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back. The waitress approached my table, holding a scuffed plastic menu and a coffee pot. It was Beatrice. She was wearing a cheap, faded polyester uniform. Her hair, once styled flawlessly in expensive salons, was pulled back into a messy utilitarian ponytail. Her fingernails were chipped, free of the glossy manicures she used to flaunt on social media. She had avoided prison time by cooperating fully with the federal investigators, turning over all the offshore routing data Julian had missed. In exchange, she received a lengthy probation sentence and an order to pay massive restitution, forcing her to work manual labor just to survive. She stopped dead in her tracks when she recognized me. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. For a fleeting second, I saw a flash of the old Beatrice, the defensive pride, the urge to lash out, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by a hollow, profound exhaustion. She looked down at the linoleum floor, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her ruined life. She expected me to gloat. She expected me to hurl insults, to demand apologies for the way she had treated me when she thought she held all the power. I did no such thing. I simply looked at her, feeling a strange, quiet sense of pity. She had been a foolish, vain follower who flew too close to her mother's destructive flame. And now she was covered in ashes. Hating her would require an emotional investment she simply did not deserve. "Just a black coffee, please," I said, my voice perfectly polite and entirely neutral. Beatrice swallowed hard, nodding once. "Right away," she whispered. She brought the coffee a moment later, her hand steadying. I drank it in silence, watching the rain slide down the diner window. When I finished, I stood up and pulled my coat on. I placed a crisp $100 bill on the table beneath my empty ceramic mug. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, nor was it an act of superiority. It was simply the closing of a door. I did not need anything from her anymore. I walked out of the diner and stepped into the cool, cleansing rain. I did not look back at the window. I got into my truck and drove toward the mountains, toward my home, leaving the ghosts of my past exactly where they belonged. The chapter was closed. I arrived back at the pasture legacy just as the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in brilliant, bruising shades of violet and gold, casting long, peaceful shadows across the sprawling grass. I walked up the wooden steps of the back porch and sat in Arthur's old rocking chair. I held a single, sealed envelope in my hands. It was the last item resting at the bottom of the cedar chest. Arthur had written on the back of it in his precise handwriting, "To be opened when the dust finally settles." The dust had settled. Margaret was in a federal penitentiary. Marcus was serving time for credit fraud. The land was safe, permanently protected by the federal government, while still serving as a sanctuary for Leo and me. I broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy parchment. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, "if you are reading this on the porch, it means the structure held. It means you stood your ground, just as I always knew you would. I spent my life organizing numbers, but you were the one who taught me how to measure true strength. You always thought you were the one leaning on me. But my love, you were the bedrock all along. Do not let my absence harden you. Keep the doors open. Watch Leo grow. Let the land heal." I read the final line of the letter, and a single, quiet tear traced its way down my cheek. It was not a tear of grief, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. "Remember, Eleanor," Arthur had written at the very bottom, "true strength never roars. It rests silently in the dark, waiting for the exact right moment to protect what it loves." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the pocket of my jacket. I looked out across the lawn. Leo was sitting in the grass, gently petting the golden retriever, entirely safe, completely loved. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pine and damp earth. I was not a fragile widow. I was not a victim. I was the architect of my own peace, guided by the brilliant, silent love of a man who had built a fortress for me out of paper and ink. If this story brought you a sense of peace or justice, please share it with someone who needs to know that the quiet ones always win in the end. Subscribe for more stories, and I will see you in the next one. The quiet ones win.